Hello and welcome to our first featured designer chat. Today I will be talking with Hannah and I'll give a whole introduction when she's here. And she should be here shortly. Welcome. For those that are joining, let us know where you're coming from. I think that would be really fun. I'm just waiting to see Hannah pop up here, and we will get started. Thanks for the hearts. Hello and welcome, everybody. There's Hannah. I'm sure if you've watched... There we go.
Knoxville, Tennessee. Fun. There she is. Hello.
Hi.
How's it going?
Oh, I'm okay. I'm armed with tea. My voice is a little bit shaky. So I've been sick this last week, but I'm recovering. I'm recovering slowly but surely. Yesterday I wasn't sure I was going to have a voice at all.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm so glad you were able to join us. It's going to be a lot of fun, I think. Thanks to everybody joining us live. Folks are sharing where they're coming from. That's Tennessee, Oregon, Wisconsin, New York. Good afternoon and welcome. So for those of you that don't know me, I am Jessica Briss. I am the knitting pattern designer and mentor behind Snickerdoodle Knits and the facilitator behind the Design Circle. And so last fall, I was asking folks, what they wanted to learn about and things like that in the Design Circle. And I found out folks are really interested in learning design stories from other designers. So I decided that would be a really fun thing to do on Instagram, because not only do designers get to hear each other's stories, but knitters then get to connect with designers that they're purchasing from. So this is a new segment here on the Snickerdoodle Knits channel where I am featuring a designer each month to really dive into their creative journey and get to know them behind the scenes, behind what we see on Instagram all the time. So I'm really excited. Hannah is our first guest. So welcome.
Oh, I didn't know I was the first one.
Yes.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So for those who have been around my channel, my Instagram for a while, Hannah was a featured guest a few months ago as well. We talked about slow knitting. So you can also check that live replay out on my Instagram. And did you post it on yours? I don't remember.
Probably. I have like a playlist on there, but it might be just like something that I'm tagged in.
Okay.
I'm not sure if they had implemented all those features yet. I feel like Instagram changes what they do every week.
Yes. Anyway, so this time last time we talked a lot more about slow knitting, the book, and just the concept. But this time we're talking about your whole design side.
Yeah, which is really fun because I don't really talk about it.
Yes.
Ever.
Yes. So for those that don't know Hannah, she is knitting pattern designer. She is the author behind the Slow Knitting book and the owner of By Hand Cereal. What else do you want to add about yourself, where you are and what you do?
Oh gosh, well, right now I live just south of Nashville, Tennessee, and I've worked in the yarn industry for over a decade at this point, and my work has been really varied. So the books are sort of more recent. They started in 2017, and before that I had really done freelance work for a lot of companies. So a lot of the design work that we're going to talk about today is mixed in that I don't own the rights to a lot of my really early designs, or I don't have the attachment to every design that maybe some designers do. I'm kind of have done some pinch hitting in terms of design. So sometimes somebody I'm working for is like, oh, we need something. And I'm like, okay, I got it. And when you design that way, I think it's a really different relationship to your work than when you spend a lot of time working on a single design and you know, concept it and work on it for months and then have like a release time that's later. So maybe it's a different kind of design than a lot of people who are listening might have worked on themselves, or maybe it's a type of design people didn't realize was pretty common.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this was actually a question I had later on, but I think this is a good time to ask it, is what do you prefer? Do you prefer self-publishing or do you prefer third-party publishing to other
Oh
people?
gosh. You know, I think self-publishing is becoming the gold standard in a lot of ways because with self-publishing, we have so much more control. Individually as designers, we get to determine everything, how the final piece looks, how long we have to work on it, what yarns we use, how it's represented and styled, and who the model is and who the photographer is. So there's a lot more control in that way. But there's also so many good experiences to be learned from working with publications and with yarn companies or you know, subscription companies. Done a lot of subscription company work because of my past job history. And so I think working on a tighter deadline, a quicker turnaround time, it teaches you to be a little less precious about everything that you're producing and to realize that sometimes a hat is just a hat. And it's okay if you don't love everything forever that you put out into the world. I think that we often forget because of how social media is and how the internet is forever now, that your work doesn't have to be representative of who you are every moment for your eternity. You know, it can show a progression of skill set and development. So there's a lot of things that I look back in at my very early catalog and I'm like, oh, the pictures, they could use some work. That design could go for another run of TE, or you know, the fit's not quite where I want it to be. But because it's over and done with and past and it's already been published and I don't own the rights to it, there's not that option to go back and resolve and rework those pieces. And having the ability to let go and move on has really taught me that not everything is as permanent as it seems.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I've only done self-publishing. I've
Okay.
definitely thought about doing third publishing a little bit, but I like having all of the control.
Yeah.
But with that also comes a lot more responsibility because you're responsible for all of the photos and the tech editing and the test knitting and the whole process. So I've definitely been interested in, is that something that I want to at least dabble in to understand a little bit more?
And now there there's so many different levels too now.
Yes. Yeah. But I do notice that when I see a call for submissions, I've submitted a couple places, and when I tell people where I've submitted for my only time I've submitted, they're like, that's probably not the best place to start because competition's so high. But anyway, I have noticed that when I submit, it usually isn't ideas like I normally have because I usually come from a very emotional place. When I create my designs, I have very intentional meaning behind it, and then I create the design instead of like creating a design just for a topic. And so they're very different kinds of design ideas.
Yeah, no, I can understand it. It's the whole designing to a brief versus designing you know, from your own idea, from your own head. I think designing to a brief is freeing in a lot of ways. You know, I don't want to be crass and say that it's like a payday, you know, but designing for a publication, designing to sell your work is good because it can kind of like get you in a good flow of understanding your own process and meeting someone else's expectations. And there have definitely been moments that I agreed to do a design and I was like, okay, great, I have 6 months to work on this and it's going to take me this many months to finish and this long to knit the sample and this long to write the pattern. And you know, mapping that all out and knowing exactly how long everything takes is good to arm yourself with as a designer, but also having someone at the end of that deadline like bugging you for it is a different experience than, you know, setting your own deadline and working towards it, because ultimately at the end of your own deadline, it's just you who is holding yourself accountable. And let people down. I'm a big people pleaser. So if I submit to a magazine or a publication or a company, I feel a huge obligation to complete it. And so I would say it's good to try at least once. In terms of going with a publication that's like really, like, let's just say like Pom Pom, where it's kind of competitive, a lot of people want to be in Pom Pom. I think that a lot is a relative number. It's not a number, but it's like a relative idea, right? Our industry is really small. So when they say they've gotten a lot of submissions, I don't know what that means for Pom Pom, probably hundreds of submissions. As someone who's received submissions, I would say I'll get anywhere between, you know, 6 and 50 submissions for the average call. And it's not that hard to go through all of them. And it's pretty easy to like pick and choose the ones that are really good fit. So I would imagine that the people on the other end of these larger publications, you know, they have a similar process to what I do when I have to choose designs. And so I just always try to think like, am I designing to the brief? Am I designing in a way that's evocative of what they're trying to achieve? And that's the most that I think anyone is asking. And if you're doing that, you're going to stand out. You're going to be in that top 10% of reviewed submissions anyway, because so many of the submissions that are received are not designed to the brief at all. So yeah, so when you hear that there's a lot of competition, just remember that like if you're going that extra mile and you're making the effort to make your piece for that, you're already separating yourself from a lot of those submissions that are going in.
Yeah, yeah. Pom Pom is the
So
only magazine I've
do
submitted to. I've only submitted to them twice. So.
yeah, I think maybe I've submitted to Pom Pom one time. I submitted to Twist Collective a couple times and got rejected when it was still in publication, but they were really sweet about it. They were like, "Oh, we love your design, but it's just not the right fit for the issue." I've been in Vogue Knitting twice, which was awesome.
Yes.
And both under Nora, who is an incredible editor and super, super kind. And I think that something that I wanted to share with other designers is that I think there's a lot of pressure for what we turn in to be perfect every time. And I really suck at the math part. Like I'm really bad at it sometimes. So don't be afraid to have someone else check your work before you turn it in. But also like take criticism and be apologetic if you make a big mistake. Just be like, yeah, I'm really sorry. I definitely messed that up. But you know, we all know that we all have room for growth. It doesn't matter who you're talking to in this industry. No one is too big to understand that.
Yeah. Yeah. Something that I think is a really interesting opportunity with working with third-party publications is especially when you're learning new things or like a new designer. I think having those bounds is helpful, like as far as sizing and things like that. Like something I've wondered about now that I'm really interested in getting into designing sweaters. It's like maybe it'd be a really good fit for me to start with a publication because they have their own sizing guidelines and things like that. And, you know, they have their own tech editors. And then, you know, like just using that kind of as an introduction into understanding the bounds for designing too.
And they have really solid tech editors too, usually. So you know that the person looking over it is looking over a lot of garments with a lot of varied construction types. Through working with magazines and companies, I've had access to tech editors that I normally wouldn't probably be able to hire on my own, just as they're kept on retainer for these larger companies. But they're like some of the most experienced people in our industry, and they will tell you, they'll be like, this is not how you do the shaping for this. This is not how this works. The way that you've done this is not the easy way. It's not the smart way. It's a really weird way that you came up with on your own. And you can do so much learning, you know, in that space. I definitely am at a place where I have a few designs under my belt, I guess, but I don't really consider myself like primarily a designer. in part because I feel like that I still have so much to learn. I'm
Mhm.
like, I need to learn more things.
Yeah, that's something I actually see quite a bit with designers. They have a hard time accepting the title designer. Where you like, I feel like you're a designer, but you also have a lot of other titles. But designers
Mhm.
in general, it's a hard thing to like say I'm a designer when you feel like you're not qualified to be a designer. But for me, it was, I don't know, I'd been designing for maybe a year or something, and I was mentioning something about, yeah, I don't really feel like a designer. I just have like, I don't know, I designed 18 patterns or something like that. And so there was a yarn dyer who's like, so at what point you consider yourself a designer?
Yeah, I
It's like,
don't know.
if you're designing patterns, I feel like you're a designer. And so that's kind of what I tell designers now. It's like, we're never going to feel like we have everything figured out. There's
No, you're
still
totally
more
right.
room for growth and learning. So, you know, once you, I think, feel like you've entered this creative journey and you're learning how to write patterns and design, you've taken on the name designer.
Yeah, it sort of accidentally happened to me. But I also feel like I'm, I have a book that I designed everything for. And I think I've got like 50 design credits, so I should probably just like own it now.
Yeah.
When I was saying it before, I was like, this is a dumb thing to say.
Yes. So anyway, I wanted to take a step back into your creative journey. But we had a
Yeah.
couple comments earlier that I thought I'd share. Hannah is an extraordinary human, brilliant writer, beautiful person, talented, smart, funny, and I could listen to her talk all day. Yes. Someone else said such a dedicated creative, knows the industry very well. Love her
Oh,
journey.
that's so sweet. Who are those people? I need to send them
So,
some chocolate. Thanks, guys. I'll pay you
the
later.
first one was Mohala _19.
Mm,
Second
it's
one was
Hillary.
Gail T54.
That's my mom.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Mom.
um,
I'll send you some
so
chocolate.
yes. Um, so where did your creative journey begin? Were you into a lot of arts and hobbies and creative crafts as a kid, or
Yeah.
where did you think it started?
Yeah, so my mom is an artist. She actually was an art professor for the Art Institute in Atlanta for a while and a graphic designer at Coca-Cola, and she's done all these amazing artistic things her whole life. And so as a kid, I was constantly surrounded by art and music. My dad is really into bluegrass music, so my childhood was like art and bluegrass music. And I she has this kind of art that encompasses a lot of the natural world, and so that's really heavily influenced sort of the way that I relate to visual media. It has to be really tactile. The colors have to kind of fit within this, I don't want to say specific spectrum, but I have like a spectrum of colors that I enjoy most. And so I thought for a long time I would be like a painter professionally.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I got to college, I realized that that's not really a job that people have. So as much as I love painting, I kind of branched out and started doing other work. I went to fashion school for a while, and then during fashion school, started working with some yarn companies, and from there, just kind of like diverged onto the yarn path full time. And I still enjoy painting. I've been trying to get back into painting for a while. I've done some watercolor in the last year. Most of my work is landscapes. So I like to work with landscapes a lot. But art is such a flighty form of expression for me that I find that it more often influences the things that I consider work just by consuming it rather than creating it. I don't have as much time as I would like to create art. I have to have like the conditions be just right for me to be in the right mood. And most of the time, the conditions are not there. Um, but I definitely pull from a lot of art for the work that I do. I pull color and emotion and that tactile, natural feel.
Yeah. So then the next question was, because you specifically had mentioned your painting as well and some of the info we shared before the live leading
Yes.
up to this. Do you feel like your painting experience has impacted the way that you design? And I think you just touched on that with colors and things like that, motion.
Yeah, I would say mostly in how I approach color. I like when I paint, I like a very rich palette of color. I want lots of saturated color. Um, I'm not the kind of artist who takes the paint and puts it out of the tube directly on the canvas. I won't work with a pure red or a pure blue. I have to always mix things together. I teach a class sometimes at Harrisville Designs in New Hampshire called, oh, now I'm afraid of the name of the class. It's about the Hudson Valley School of Painting, which is landscape painters in New England in the late 1900s. And part of what makes their work really special is that it captures this feeling of reality in all of the color choices. There's no like off the wall color choices. So the way that you achieve that as a painter is by taking pure colors and layering them to create semi-neutral colors that are kind of muddied up. And so that's become my sort of sweet spot for operating within when it comes to choosing colors for yarn or projects materials. I'm not as inclined to go for a really bright saturated color. I usually pick something in that semi-neutral range because it just makes me feel comfortable. It feels more existent, I guess, is a word I'm going to use. I like to use a pop of color every once in a while, but it has to be so specific, like a lapis lazuli blue or a vermilion red, like a color that occurs so randomly in nature and is like super special when you see it out, is the pop of color that I'm usually drawn to.
Woolen palette says the colors in between colors.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that is the best way to describe it for sure.
Yeah. So then how did you start designing? How did you
Oh gosh. So this is actually really funny because it relates to one of the patterns that I mentioned to you leading up to this. I was working so I'd been knitting for a long time. I learned to knit when I was 8 years old, and then I it was just kind of like a hobby that I picked up and put down a lot in my teen years. And then in college, I kind of got back into it. And I didn't think in the beginning that I was going to do much designing, but I was always like kind of fiddling around with things because I didn't have a pattern. So I would be like, how many stitches goes around my wrist? How many stitches goes around my head? Just like casting things on and measuring them. I had a lot of unfinished objects for a long time. And I was working with Malabrigo yarns. I went down to Uruguay for an internship with them, and I lived in Montevideo for 2 months, which was amazing. And they were coming out with a brand new yarn called Rasta, which was like a big, thick, bulky stranded yarn. And they needed a pattern for this yarn's release that they could like advertise with the yarn. And I was there and I knew how to knit. And so they were like, do you want to try something? You could try the yarn before anyone else. And so I knit up this cowl while I was there called the Howling Winds Cowl. And I named it that because it was winter in Montevideo and I thought it would not be cold. And I didn't bring a coat with me. So I had to buy like the cheapest coat I could find. And then I knit this cowl, and the whole purpose of this cowl is to be as warm as possible. So I knit the Howling Winds cowl, and then here is a version that I just knit a couple weeks ago because I'm actually revisiting this pattern this year, but it was my first officially released pattern for anybody. And it's super, super simple. It just features an I-cord edging, and then you've got these like slip stitches. But it was such a random hit. Like it took off. It remains one of my most popular patterns to date. It's been translated into a few different languages. Malabrigo paid to have it translated into Japanese, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
And it was like my first pattern release. And it was, again, one of those instances where somebody I was working for was like, hey, we need something. Do you want to try it? And I was like, yeah, I can do that. So a lot of my early designs kind of fit that pattern. Some of them I made, my mom and I used to own a yarn store in Iowa. And so I would design things to go on display for specific yarn. And so I just kind of began working slowly up towards other things. I would compete in little design contests on Ravelry. I designed a hat once for a competition that an indie dyer was having. It was like, design something that goes with hand spun. So I designed a hat for that. Or I'll find a yarn and, you know, design something around the yarn. But I didn't really approach garments for a really long time because they made me very nervous. And I feel like there's so many ways to put together a garment, and I haven't knit enough garments to really fully, in my mind, fully comprehend how all of them work. So I kind of stayed away from garments for a long time because of it. Socks became my sweet spot for a while. I've designed a few sock patterns because I really get socks. Like, I understand them. But with sweaters, it scared me. So my first sweater design I didn't do until, I don't know, 2018, 2019. I designed this piece, which is called the Chocolate Challah Pullover. And it was featured in the Coffee House Knits book from Interweave. And it's got like a really, of course, because, you know, if you don't know how to do something simple, you should do something insane, right? So it's got a really weird construction. Essentially, you knit the body, and then you knit this little apex point with short rows because I'm crazy. And then you knit these two panels that form your shoulders that have cables on them, and you attach them, and then you pick up the sleeve and knit the sleeve. And this piece was, I don't know what I was thinking when I designed this piece. I love it. I love the way that it looks. But I was like, I don't know how the tech editor must have felt looking at it. They were like, why did you do this to us? But I think it comes from maybe going to fashion school and just being like, oh, you can build a garment out of anything. Just cut some pieces and then you can like put them together and you can make it work. And so that's kind of how I approached my first sweater design. I was like, well, I don't really understand like the raglan ratios or the formula for a set-in sleeve design, but I can figure out how to make some pieces and then they could go together and be a garment. And so that was the first foray into garment knitting.
So how did the grading go for that for you?
Surprisingly well, because the people who work for companies like Interweave, like they know what they're doing.
So did they do the grading for you then?
They did do the grading for me.
Okay.
I included a chart with my attempt at the grading, which is kind of about as much as I've ever been able to deliver in terms of grading. It's like, here's my idea of how the grading might work. And then they look at it and they go, no, this is not, that's sweet, bless your heart. You know, but no, it's not how any of it works. So there was some back and forth just to make sure that I understood what I was trying to achieve and they understood what I was trying to achieve. And then they were able to kind of like finesse the numbers. But I really have a huge admiration for technical editors and all that they've done for me. Thank you.
Yes, I can agree to that. They're amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Such a wealth of knowledge.
Yeah.
I didn't, and this is not my recommendation for designers, don't do what I did, but I waited a year before I had all of my patterns tech edited. And then my tech editor, she taught me how to do charted instructions and like how to write patterns more clearly and things like that. And I just adore her.
Yeah.
It's just amazing. But definitely have your patterns tech edited, designers, please.
Yeah, no, it's super important. I feel like it's more important now than it ever has been, especially with how many patterns are available. Having really reliable, easy to read, functional patterns is important. And even with the best possible tech editors, we're working with tons of numbers, so many numbers, so many individual lines. Knitting is code, essentially. You're writing pages and pages of code, and then you're expecting other people to read it and create something using it. And so even the best tech edited pieces can have errors. So what I do actually now, and I haven't released a pattern in a while, but what I try to do for garment patterns moving forward is have them tech edited before I send them to the final publication or the final outlet, so that they're actually tech edited twice by different people. Because with my book, there have been a couple errors, things that I, don't really have. My first book, like, I didn't write the patterns for that one. I hired people who were very much more experienced. And even with those like super experienced celebrity designers involved, there's still some errors. And so just having additional eyes on anything is a good idea.
Yes, yes. Okay, so I want to talk about your design process. Like you've mentioned that a lot of times it, starts by somebody else's request. What does the design process then look like for you?
Well, the first question that I have is always, how much time do I have? And it can vary. For some of the pieces that I've worked on, you've had as little as a week, and up to sometimes 1 or 2 months short notice. Sometimes it's longer, sometimes 6 months, sometimes 3 months. But usually it's like really short notice that I get asked. And pretty much at that point, it's just, you're landing the plane. You got to put the wheels down, so swatch first, figure out what needle size I'm going to use, what fabric I want to achieve, what I can do within that gauge, knowing the general number framework of the kind of piece that I want to create. If it's a hand warmer, does it have lots of negative ease, or is it going to be a little bit of positive ease for a slouchy look? I kind of have a working idea the whole time, but I have to be prepared to revise on the fly with that kind of like tight timeline. And sometimes the first thing that you go in and try to do doesn't work. And so there's a lot of ripping out. I have a piece that's actually on a really tight deadline right now that I've been working on. And I think I've restarted it 4 times in the past 48 hours just to get the sizing quite right so I can move on. And it's color work. So I could do a color work swatch and then wash it up, but it's a hand warmer. So it makes a little more sense to knit the thing and then see where it comes out. So that's kind of, I don't want to say that it's a rushed feeling, but it's like a continually moving feeling. There's not the same sort of sense of, okay, I've got my color palette and I'm going to take the gauge swatch and look at it for a few weeks and think about what it wants to be, or that I have with designs that are on my own timeline.
Yeah, so then what do the designs that are on your own
timeline? I would say they start with sketches. I do a lot more sketching for designs that I'm designing from scratch for myself on my own timeline. I sketch and then I think about what yarn I want to achieve the fabric. So I have kind of a memory bank of yarns at this point in my head. I'm like, I remember this specific texture and I have 5 different yarns that I can achieve that with. And so then I'll pull from my archive of stash things and try to figure out what texture is the best fit. I might swatch on 2 or 3 different needle sizes to see what I want, or maybe 2 or 3 different stitch textures. Sometimes I have a pretty vague idea, like I would like some kind of seed stitch like texture for the body of a sweater, but I don't know if I want a 1x1 or a 2x2, or if I want a larger basket weave. So I'll try them all and then see where I end up. And then after I do that, I'll, block and wash the swatches, lay them out, look at them in different lighting, hang them up and go like this. There's a lot more touchy-feeliness to that process. And then the actual act of knitting actually typically comes after I do a bunch of the math. So I'll try to write the whole pattern out and then knit the pattern a whole time through and correct as I go if something doesn't go according to plan. It took a while to feel confident doing that because I think it feels counter to what I really want to do, which is just sit down and knit the thing. And sometimes I'll write it in pieces. Like if it's a sweater and I know that the back and the front, it's like going to be a drop shoulder or something, I'll calculate the circumference and then I'll knit the body up to the part where anything changes, just to get that I want to knit with this yarn for 16 hours feeling out of the way.
Yes.
And then I'll worry about the math when I get up here. But there's definitely downsides to that as well, because what if you have to tweak something or your gauge number is not the easiest to do the math with? I think that there's a lot to be said for knowing exactly what gauge numbers are easiest to manipulate. And that's a place that I think it takes a while to get as a designer, and I'm definitely not there yet. And I think technical editors get there a little faster because they see all the numbers all the time. But I know a lot of designers try to work in like consistent multiples, and I'm not there yet. AirPods gave up.
Are you able to see here
for a second? Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's interesting, like how much flexibility we have as designers with the design process, how many different ways there are to go about it. Like I have a process a lot more similar to yours, but there are some people who just pick up the yarn and start knitting and making stuff, and that's not the way I operate. But I think it's really interesting, like just how many different ways creativity can be manifested and be made into something that we love and enjoy making and using.
Yeah.
So what is do you have a favorite part of the process or a least favorite part of the process?
I love sketching and swatching. I love the actual knitting, except for the last 2 weeks of the knitting.
Just want to see it done.
Yeah, the last 2 weeks when I'm like, the deadline, it's coming. That part stresses me out every time. Yeah, I love the initial stage. Honestly, I think that I would be very happy in a position where I just do the concepting and then I just knit whatever I want in my own free time. Like if I could just hand it off and be like, I knit this swatch for you. And I know that is possible. I have some tech editors who I've talked to that said that they would work with me that way if I wanted, but it feels a little disingenuous sometimes to work that way, because it's like, oh, I'm not actually doing the knitting. But I think that it's possible to let go of that feeling, because it's not like every fashion designer sits down and sews their own garment, and you don't think less of them. I don't know. I just love the artistic part, the concepting part, the choosing the yarn and the colors and, building the fabric that's going to be used. And then the numbers part, someone else could do that. I could let someone else do that.
Yeah, I think it really probably comes down to what your definition of a designer is and what you want to be as a designer. Because sometimes we do have these concepts of what it should look like, but it doesn't necessarily need to look like that, and we can adjust that to what actually works for us. I haven't talked to her a lot, but I do know somebody here in the Charlotte area who works for Universal Yarn, and it sounds like she does a lot of that kind of work where she designs it, but she's not actually knitting it. So she has tons and tons of designs that she's created, of course, but it's a lot of process.
That's a job.
You're not knitting it.
That's a job with a tight timeline. I actually worked at Universal Premiere in 2009, 2010. So I think I know who you're talking about. But yeah, it's that kind of work is a super tight timeline too. A lot of times you're working and you get the yarn, you get samples of the yarn, and you need everything in a couple months. And it's not just one piece, it's like 6 pieces, and there's no feasible way to do that as one person.
Yeah, I think for myself, I don't know that I'm familiar enough with knitting and how everything fits together textural wise to be able to do that. I hadn't been knitting all that long before I started designing. So I still often have to see my swatches, like right now I happen to be working on a new project, but see how the swatches look next to each other, because I'm like, okay, I do not like this and
Yeah.
everything else I have going on. So if I were to design it and have somebody else knit it, I still don't have quite a good enough grasp to
Oh yeah, there's a
set it
lot
up.
that I rework. You know,
Yes.
you get it going and you're like, now I'm gonna change to this other stitch, and then you start, and you're like, oh no, that's not good. That's not a good transition. Or
Yes.
the gauge changes so much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. So let's talk about your design. What do you most enjoy designing, and which is your favorite design?
Yeah, I mean, I really love designing garments. I do. I wish that I was better at it, but I think that that comes with practice. Um, I told you in our pre chat that my favorite design is the coffee hour pullover from seasonal slow knitting, and I think that this piece is my favorite just because it's my favorite one to wear. The yarn and the shape and the pattern and the size and the ease of the knitting, it just feels like the best possible combination for me, because I just like to sit down and knit. I don't want to do too much counting. I don't want to do too much thinking. uh, Fiddly patterns have never really been my thing. I know that a lot of people love them, and power to you guys. Awesome. But for me, I just want to sit and watch TV and knit something for an endless amount of time. So this combination is so nice because you've got the kind of the detail of the linen stitch, and this was pretty tricky to work out because like you were talking about, the transitional from one gauge to another is like wildly difficult to calculate. But I finally got this one pulled together. I must have reknit it a million times. But it uses linen stitch for this like super structured neck, funnel neck, and then it settles into this stockinette stitch for the body, which is like a yoke construction, and then it has a split hem at the bottom. The one is longer than the other, and it finishes in that same linen stitch, and the cuffs also taper and then finish in the linen stitch. And for me, it was the perfect. I knew what I wanted to do. I drew the picture of it, and then I made it happen. And as a designer, that's the most rewarding arc, like the most rewarding storyline for a piece, because so often that is not what happens. You draw the picture, you do the swatches, you get halfway through, you're like, none of this works. I have to start over. Or something goes wrong in the middle. And so it was so good to have this piece start and finish on the same note. And so for me, that's been one of my bigger, I guess, achievements is this particular sweater.
Yeah, that's fun. And I like how you mentioned like it's also something that you really love to wear. I think that's something, at least for me, I love all of my designs. Yeah, I'd say I love them all. But they're the ones that I wear are the ones that I start to get even more attached to. This one, at the time that I designed it, I didn't love knitting garter. I was like bored and like I wanted to be doing something more interesting. But it's one that I wear all of the time because it's just cozy and simple, and so it's really become one of my favorites.
Yeah. Yeah, if I wear it all the time, I know that it's wearable, you know.
Yes.
And I think that ultimately that is what most of us are trying to achieve, is a piece that someone wants to feel that way about. So if you can feel that way about your own work, that's super rewarding.
Yeah, it's something that I've been kind of trying to move more towards, is designing more patterns that I love to wear, because they kind of patterns that I enjoy knitting and the kind of patterns that I enjoy wearing are not the same.
Yeah.
So trying to find that balance there. But speaking of balance, then how do you balance your knitting time? Is it hard to separate designing time from knitting time, or is it pretty easy because you have clear design projects, or how does that work for you?
Well, right now I haven't taken on a lot of design work because my non-design work is pretty full, um, with all the stuff that I'm trying to juggle. The design part of my work has always been sort of a secondary, I guess, extracurricular thing, except when I was doing the book, then it was, very first and foremost, I need to knit for this many hours a day and I need to think about patterns for this many hours a day. Um, but generally I knit in the evenings or in the morning or over my lunch break. I work from home full time. So if I'm having computer fatigue, screen fatigue, I'll go sit with a knitting project for a while and work on something. I've gotten really good at multitasking. So I actually can knit and like read a book at the same time. Or um yeah, I think that knitting is sort of just something that I still fit in between all the other sections of my day. And that might be why I don't get as much done as I would like. If I were to sit down and just dedicate, 4 hours, 6 hours a day to knitting on specific designs, I would probably design a lot more and release a lot more patterns. So for me, it's not the prominent part of my business,
Yeah.
is design work. Um, but I do enjoy it. So it just kind of, for me right now, it fits in between everything else.
Yeah. So another question I had was, how has your designing changed as you've taken on these additional roles inside of the fiber industry?
Yeah, yeah. So I would say that I still sort of always put design as like an adjacent thing, an adjacent project. I think that to be a full-time designer and to focus your energy entirely on that is probably not for me. Like it's a little too stressful for me when things don't work out how I'd like them to work out, or I can't get a concept to work, um, or the math isn't making sense to me. I get pretty frustrated with it. I like to keep it more light and more fun, more artistic than some of my other work. So I sort of consider it um, adjacent or extracurricular to the other work that I do. And the more work that I take on that's administrative or operational or conceptual, the kind of stuff that I'm doing with by hand serial or my freelance work, the less knitting time I actually have. So right now, most of what I knit outside of this design that I'm working on at the moment is just for fun. It has no deadline. It has no specific purpose, and it's usually from someone else's pattern at the moment.
Yeah. So you want to share a little bit more about what you do in the other parts of your business? And I'm also really curious, your work with by hand serial with other designers.
Yeah.
Change how you think about designing or anything like that?
Not really, because I've been working with other designers for a long time.
Yeah.
So I got started really I started hiring designers for projects really at the very beginning of my career. When I worked for Malabrigo, we started a program called the Malabrigo Freelance Pattern Project. And it was kind of before a lot of people were doing independent design. It was sort of a newer idea to be an independent designer. And the goal of it was to provide yarn support and let people release these micro collections. And so my job was to coordinate all of that. So I got really used to reaching out to people and being like, hey, I love your work. I can get you yarn. What colors do you want? Here's your deadline. Let me do the check-ins. So when I started doing that for other things, like I worked at 2 different yarn subscription companies where they've got like a monthly pattern that comes out. And then I've worked with by hand for 5 years before taking it over this last August. That's become such a flow for me that I really don't think about it that much anymore. I think what is beneficial about that is you realize that while everyone's time restraints might not be the same, like preference wise, there is a standard amount of time that it takes to complete certain things. And most designers can reasonably complete an accessory in about 3 months. Like a really high quality accessory design can be released in about 3 months, start to finish. And a sweater could even be released in that window. It's a little harder to execute a sweater on that timeline. My favorite timeline is 6 months, because I think that any longer and things tend to languish, and any shorter and people feel rushed. So 6 months is like a really good sweet spot. If anybody's watching this and they're like, well, how much time should I give myself? Try 6 months. It's a good timeline for a garment. And 3 months for an accessory is a really good timeline. And it matches a lot of the magazine timelines. So teaching myself to mostly work towards that, I think would have been the largest takeaway from working with so many other designers. The other thing is just the endless creativity that other people have is really inspiring. For by hand, I'm kind of on hold there for a little bit with the print publication. We tried to do a design. I tried to do a design call for a couple issues that I thought I was going to be able to produce this year, but with COVID being the way that it is and travel being more difficult and everything has gotten more expensive, I just decided to like backpedal on that. And that was a really hard decision to make. And it was hard to reach out to all the designers. But I think people were very understanding because no one had started knitting yet. I think if everyone had started knitting, it was a little bad. But I was able to kind of say like, look, I just want to make sure that we have the time and the money and energy that needs to be dedicated to this to make it what I want it to be. And I just couldn't do that this year. My goal with that publication and really anything that I'm personally producing and putting out that involves other designers is to provide a space that recognizes individual people's artistry and doesn't just see what designers are doing as a commodity that fills the role of selling yarn. Often design in this space has been seen as, I've even seen it described as a necessary evil, which is so cringy to me, to sell yarn. And the thing is that a good design can sell any yarn. It doesn't matter what yarn I used for this sweater. I mean, I picked a yarn for a very specific reason to me, but anyone who has an Aran weight yarn could knit this sweater, and it's because as a design, it works with a lot of different yarns. And for me, that's what great design is. It's not restricted by the material choice. It allows freedom for the knitter within that space. So the idea that knitting has to sell yarn is kind of counterintuitive to that. Mm-hmm. And so with everything that I'm doing, I'm trying to think about why it's being done, because there's no real need for more patterns in this space, but there is a need for more voices. There is a need for things that we haven't seen before, or things that are more versatile, or better explanations, or clearer access to a technique, or introducing something in a way that someone hasn't seen it before feels more approachable. So when I'm hiring designers and when I'm designing things now, I'm thinking about that a lot more.
Yeah,
because of the work.
Yeah. It's interesting as a designer, because of course we are choosing very specific yarns, but then I think one of the most, well, and I know from a lot of my audience because I've done both, some of the most rewarding work is when you get to the end of test knitting and you see all of the different varieties with different yarns and completely different colors, different price points, and just seeing how versatile designs are and how it really does fit so many different kinds of people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, it's about creating that final wearable piece.
Yeah.
As opposed to, just creating something.
Yes. So I thought that, I don't know that I've really thought of that before, as I don't know that I've heard so much of patterns being just for selling yarn, but that makes sense knowing what I've seen. Mm-hmm. And I hadn't really thought a whole lot of that. It's a different perspective.
Yeah, I think it's shifting. I think for a long time that was kind of the view in the industry, was the pattern's purpose is to sell the yarn. And now independent designers have especially been redefining that. A lot of independent designers have been using a huge variety of yarns. And like you were saying with the test knitters and hype knitters, people who are just knitting it for fun or knitting early, preview knitting, they're creating this inside look at the creativity that each of us possesses as an individual knitter. And they're saying, like, you can do this too. And it's almost removing the yarn from the equation in a lot of ways. Like, the yarn is a medium and we can love it. I mean, obviously we love it, but it's not the definition of what makes the garment.
Yeah.
It's what you put into it. Yeah.
Yeah, and you don't have to have a very specific yarn to love your finished object. It doesn't have to be exactly what the designer used.
Definitely.
So in thinking about your patterns and your designs, do you feel like there's any sort of overarching themes in what you create, or what makes them unique, either from the design perspective or the way you write your patterns?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to put your finger on that.
Yes.
I would say that I have a more defined color palette than I do defined design style. I tend to design things that have positive ease because I feel like sweaters should ultimately be comfortable. I try to think about when I reach for which type of garment. So where I live, a sweater is something that you're usually layering over other items. So I want a little more roominess in it. It's something that you are wearing in place of a sweatshirt because you don't. There's like this utilitarian nature, I think, to a lot of my designs, but I also love little funny details. Like on the friendship bracelet cardigan, I included these Latvian braids at the cuffs and the hem. And those are the places, the little details on the cuffs, on the hem, the button band, the button choice, where I tend to get a little bit more creative because I want to explore the idea of reminiscing or nostalgia or mental recall. So for this, it was about friendship bracelets that you make at camp when you're a kid, and you saw all stack those embroidery floss friendship bracelets, or the like braided plastic ones. And then with this piece, the pavilion cardigan, which I still have not independently released, I wanted to explore the idea of doing a button band that had I-cord as the button band. So it was like applied I-cord, and then I would skip where the buttons went. And it was designed to go with these very specific buttons that look like little seashells, because it was for an issue of By Hand where we were at the seashore in Brighton in the UK. And so usually it's just like a tiny little thing that I latch onto, and then I end up designing the whole thing around that like one little tiny idea. And then sometimes it's a broader thing. With the coffee hour, I just wanted like a sweater that I could reach for on the coldest day of the year and pull on over my pajamas and drink coffee in it. I have to resist writing the same description for every garment, where I'm like, this is the sweater you can wear to throw on when you go out and get the mail at the mailbox. Because for me, that's like one of the only times I wear a sweater is in the morning. It just doesn't get cold enough here, but in the morning when I'm like waking up and it's cold, I'm like, I just want the biggest, heaviest sweater I can wear, and pull it on so I can get the mail out of the mailbox. So I feel like that's a line of copy I've written and then deleted 100 times in descriptions. Put this on to get the mail from the mailbox or walk the dog. So just like non-glamorous everyday life kind of pieces that are ultimately utilitarian and fun to knit, not difficult to knit, approachable. Make the most of the yarn.
I love that. Do you have any other designs you want to show us that you have with you?
Let me see what I got at the table. Okay, so got Howling Winds Cow, which I'm going to re-release, I think, next month with two shapes. So the original was like a lot wider, like longer, and it has a confusing instruction that everyone writes into me about all the time and has for like almost 10 years. So it's probably time for me to like revise that. So this one will be re-released really soon. This is a piece that gets overlooked a lot, but it's probably one of my most used items. This is the Thuza cozy. It's named for one of my cats. And it's a water bottle cover. And I don't know if anybody out there watching has a hot water bottle, but this is like such a lifesaver for me. I have really cold feet. I don't know if anyone gets cold, like really, really cold toes. But even with wool socks on, I have cold toes all the time. So in the winter, even when it's not super cold here, I will fill this up with hot water and put it under the sheets so that when my toes go down there, they have something to be warm. And putting a wool water bottle cozy on it was so satisfying to me. And I spun the yarn for this myself. Now this pattern's in seasonal slow knitting, and it's super easy to knit, but I actually just got done spinning like 6 skeins of the same yarn, and I'm going to list them in the shop soon, so that if anyone wants the same exact colorway of special hand spun by me, you can have your very own Thuza cozy in the exact same color.
That's
Yeah,
so fun.
and then I was hunting around earlier trying to find if I had anything in progress I could show you, and I thought I would show off a swatch that I've been kind of rattling around for a while.
Yeah.
So this swatch has been photographed a few times for different things, but this is like an example of something that you were talking about, using different textures together. And so this is a swatch for a cardigan that I've been kind of toying with, and this would be like the button band side, and this would be the body side, but it uses a cable and like 4 different stitches, and so maybe that will be a sweater someday.
I love it. It's beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, and this is using a Romney Merino blend from Battenkill. And for me, the yarn it's really kind of like all about the yarn sometimes.
Yeah, because we were mentioning, like designs are versatile. You can use lots of different yarns, but it is also a thing which I haven't gotten nearly as much into, like you talk about. And there are really specific qualities about yarn. And
oh yeah,
there are, even though you can make designs in a lot of different kinds of yarns, you get different results based on your
totally different textures. It's sheep breeds are like a whole new realm of geekiness. And I feel like if anyone sees me at a show and you want to have a long chat, like let's get a cocktail and talk about sheep breeds for like a few hours. I'm so into it. I love different textures that come from all the different breeds of wool. So that's become one of my big nerdy aspects involving this craft. I am a serial wool collector. I want to try all the sheep.
Yeah, I find it fascinating just how many different details there are in everything in our industry, because like when you first start knitting, it's like, oh yeah, there's yarn, there's patterns, you knit, and then it's like, oh, there's like hand dyed yarn, and then there's like hand spun yarn, and I could spin my own yarn, and oh, then there's this whole thing with where the sheep come from and the fleece, and understanding all of that and all of the different characteristics of that and all the characteristics of designing. It's just like,
yes,
opening
and
up.
there's always going to be someone you talk to who's going to blow your mind, because you'll feel like you have a good handle on one of those categories, and then you'll meet someone and you're like, oh, I'm super geeky about this, and they're like, let me tell you. And you're like, wow, I didn't realize that the rate of spin versus grist versus this equals this. Like it can get so technical, just beyond. But it's also a very self-informed process. So we learn so much just by trying things. And I love that there's no limitation or limitation on, there's obviously like some limitations on access. You know, we can't just buy everything that we want. Most people can't just buy everything that they want to try. But I would say most knitters can very easily get their hands on at least a little bit of any material that they would like to work with. Maybe not Kiviot. I haven't tried Kiviot yet either. But, you know, if you want to try 15 different sheep breeds, it's not going to be that expensive to go out and try 15 different sheep breeds over the course of a year. And so there's so many ways to explore that are right there. They're so available to us, which is really exciting.
Yeah. And it's amazing with the internet now how much we can learn from other people who have explored these things too.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, if you can't try it, read about it.
Yes.
I mean, I'm not going to raise silkworms anytime soon, but I know a lot about it because I've listened to so much information on it. Yeah.
So I kind of want to bring this back to the beginning about craft and being creative. You still take time for other hobbies and crafts? And
yes, I try to. I do like to sew and quilt. Lately, I've been doing a lot of spinning. Hand spinning tends to be my go-to just because it's a little bit more mindless. I'm in a season of life right now where my brain is working really hard during the day. And so in the evening, I just want to unwind, usually with something simple and low engagement. So spinning is really good for that. Quilting, the hand quilting aspect is good for that. The piecing, not so much. There's a lot of math involved with piecing and cutting, all the cutting. So I haven't been doing as much quilting lately, but I do love spinning. And if I feel like I just can't get into any new project, sometimes I'll just sit down and swatch. Like that's the easiest. I'll just pull whatever's rattling around in a bin and be like, you get swatched today. You get a swatch. Yeah, so
that's fun. I love that. So real quick, as we finish up before I ask for all of your info, what is your favorite yarn, favorite color to knit with, and favorite stitch?
Oh, okay. Favorite yarn. You know, that changes week to week. Right now, I have a couple skeins of yarn that I've just been keeping in my stash forever, and I just like touch them sometimes. And so I'd have to say those are my favorite yarns.
Yes.
One is the Middlebrook Fiberworks. Anne Choi is a small-scale fiber farmer in New Jersey. She's part of the New Jersey Fiber Shed, and she does the most beautiful Shetland blends using her own Shetlands and then other fibers available to her through the mill. And I have some of, I think it's vintage number 3. Each year there's a different vintage, like wine. And it's this beautiful, kind of like soft camel color with like a gold shine to it. And it's so gorgeous. And I don't know what it needs to be, but every time I open the yarn cabinet, I look at it and I'm like, it's so beautiful. So I have to say that's my favorite yarn in the moment. And then favorite color to knit with. Oh, that's a hard one. I guess I should just be loyal to myself and say that I like a yellowy green because I reach for a lot of yellowy green.
I was expecting that's where you would go. But.
Yeah, I really love it, but I really love knitting with so many different colors. I just feel like there's something about creating a swath of fabric that's very satisfying. I love working with blue, but it's not a color that I use very often in my designs or that I have very often in my stash. I'm really obsessed with like a super strong ultramarine blue. And then favorite stitch texture is always seed stitch. I love seed stitch. I love knitting seed stitch. I love designing with seed stitch. I love making people cry with seed stitch. A lot of people hate knitting seed stitch.
Yes.
Yeah, but I love it. I don't know why.
I enjoy it for a while, like if it's just like a border or something. But I do get to the point where like, okay, I'm ready for it.
I can knit you a whole blanket and see it. I'll knit it. You know that I'm sure you've seen that color block wrap that Pearl Soho has. It's like, massively wide and like 6 feet long, and it's all, I knit that. I knit that thing. I was like, this is a magical project.
Yes. Yes, I love it. Okay, so well, thank you so much for everybody for joining us. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you, guys.
Where can folks find you and your work online?
Yeah, so on Instagram, I'm Hannah Belle Knits. So it's HANNAHBELLE Knits. On Ravelry, I'm Hannah Belle. That's been my name almost everywhere for a long time. So if you just search Hannah Belle, you'll probably find me all over the internet. My website is my name, Hannah Thiessen. So HANNAHTHIESSEN.com. And it's got links kind of everything else. It's got links to By Hand Cereal and my project, the Yarn Directory, which is a slow knitting directory of yarns that I've personally researched. And I'm trying to think if there's anywhere else on the web that I like hang out routinely. I think that's pretty much it. I try not to be all over too many social media. I have a Facebook, but I don't really use it. Don't send me messages on Facebook. I'll never see them.
Yes. And if you're watching the replay, I will have those links down below in the description. They're clickable on YouTube and on the Instagram live replay. If you're looking at just the post, you have to click on the live to get the actual clickable link. But yeah, those will be there. So
thank you so
much for joining me. This was a lot of fun, and everybody else really enjoyed it too. So the replay will be up in just a moment.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Yes, you too. And I hope you're feeling better soon.
I'm turning the corner, I think.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much. Talk to you later.
Bye.